The autumn of 1892 settled over the hills of Virginia like a quiet warning. The trees burned gold and red, yet the air felt heavy, as if the season itself carried sorrow. On a narrow country road, a black carriage rolled forward through wet leaves and fading light. Inside sat Miss Eleanor Whitmore, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her reflection pale against the window glass. With every mile that carried her away from her father's house, she felt something inside her grow smaller, as though she were disappearing into the mist that followed the carriage wheels. She had not chosen this journey. She had not chosen the man waiting at the end of it. Her father had chosen for her. 3 nights earlier, he had stood in his study, unable to meet her eyes. The oil lamp had cast trembling shadows across his face, and though he tried to speak firmly, his voice shook. His business ventures had failed. His gambling debts had grown beyond control. The Whitmore estate was on the brink of ruin. Only one solution remained: marriage. Not to a neighbor's son, not to a man who had courted her kindly, but to the Duke of Ashford, a powerful and wealthy man from a neighboring county. A man nearly 10 years her senior. A man she had met only once. That single meeting replayed in her mind as the carriage continued forward. He had stood tall by the window of her father's study, sunlight behind him, his expression unreadable. His name was Adrian Ashford. His shoulders were broad, his posture straight, his voice controlled and distant. He had asked polite questions about her education, her interests. Her health. He had not once smiled, but he had not once truly looked at her. To him, she had felt like an obligation. Now she was to become his wife. The carriage turned through tall iron gates that creaked open with a sound that made Eleanor's heart tighten. Ashford Manor rose before her, built of gray stone and sharp lines. It stood against the fading sky like something unmovable and ancient. The windows reflected the evening light, but there was no warmth in them. Ivy crawled along one wall, as if the earth itself was trying to claim the house back. The gardens were overgrown. Hedges had lost their shape. Paths were swallowed by weeds and fallen leaves. It was a place once grand, now quiet and forgotten. The carriage stopped. An older footman opened the door and extended his hand. Eleanor stepped down slowly, her boots touching gravel that seemed too loud in the silence. A handful of servants waited at the entrance, their expressions polite but empty. They bowed and curtsied, but there was no welcome in their eyes. Only duty. Mrs. Caldwell, the housekeeper, stepped forward. She was tall, her gray hair pulled tight into a severe knot. Her gaze swept over Eleanor quickly, measuring her. "Your Grace," she said, her tone respectful but cool. "Your rooms have been prepared in the East Wing." The title felt strange, heavy. She was no longer Miss Whitmore. She was Duchess of Ashford. But she did not feel powerful. She followed Mrs. Caldwell through tall doors into a vast entrance hall. The ceilings stretched high above her, disappearing into shadow. Portraits of stern faces lined the walls, watching her as she passed. The floors gleamed, but the air felt cold, despite the fires burning in distant grates. The house was too large for the silence it carried. Her chambers overlooked the back gardens and a small lake beyond. The room was beautiful in structure. Tall windows, a carved 4-post bed, a writing desk placed with careful precision. Yet the space felt empty, as if it had waited too long for someone to belong there. A young maid helped her remove her traveling cloak. The girl's hands trembled slightly, and when Eleanor thanked her, the maid looked surprised, almost frightened, as if kindness were unexpected in this house. "You will dine with His Grace at 8, Mrs. Caldwell informed her before leaving. Alone at last, Eleanor moved slowly through the room. She touched the edge of the desk, the back of a chair, the smooth wood of the bedpost. Everything was fine, and everything was polished, but none of it felt like hers. On the desk lay writing paper and ink. Beside it rested a small leather-bound journal. Curiosity pulled her closer. She opened it gently. The pages were filled with neat handwriting belonging to the former Duchess, Adrian's mother. The entries spoke of garden plans, dinners hosted, visitors received. Simple daily details. The last entry was dated nearly 12 years earlier. There had been no dramatic farewell. Just a final note about spring roses. Eleanor closed the journal carefully. A strange sadness pressed against her chest. This house had known another woman once, another bride, another life. Would it swallow her too? Evening arrived too quickly. She dressed in a simple cream silk gown, modest and soft. She pinned her mother's brooch at her collar, tracing it with her finger, as if it could give her courage. When she entered the dining room, her breath caught. The table stretched long enough to seat dozens. Only 2 places were set at one end. Candles flickered along the polished wood, their light reflecting like dark water. Adrian Ashford stood by the fireplace. He turned as she entered. For the first time, she saw him clearly. His features were strong, almost severe. His jaw firm, his dark eyes sharp and observant. He was not handsome in a gentle way. He was striking in a way that made it difficult to look away. "Your Grace," he said formally, bowing slightly. "I trust your journey was safe." "Yes," she replied quietly. "It was without trouble." They sat across from each other. The distance between them felt larger than the table itself. Servants moved silently. Was bringing course after course. The food was fine, yet Eleanor could barely swallow. He ate methodically, controlled, every movement precise. Silence settled thick between them. Finally, he spoke. "I understand this arrangement was not your choice," he said, his voice low and steady. "For that, I regret the circumstances. Though I do not apologize. Necessity often demands decisions we would not otherwise make." His honesty surprised her. She set down her fork carefully and met his eyes. "We are both bound by duty," she said. "I will fulfill mine as best I can." He studied her for a long moment. "You will manage the household," he continued. "Represent the family when required. Beyond that, I ask little of you." A pause followed. "Our lives will remain largely separate. I believe distance may provide comfort to us both." The words struck harder than she expected. Separate. She had braced herself for obligation, for expectation. She had not prepared for rejection. She nodded once. "Very well." The meal ended soon after. He excused himself for estate matters. She returned to her chambers, the vast hallway echoing with her footsteps. At her window, she looked out at darkness covering the grounds. The world beyond the glass felt endless and cold. For the first time since leaving home, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet ache of someone who has realized she is utterly alone. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams of long corridors and locked doors chased her until morning. When she woke, gray light filtered through the curtains. But for a moment she forgot where she was. Then, memory settled heavily upon her. She dressed in a pale green morning gown and descended for breakfast. The Duke had already ridden out, Mrs. Caldwell informed her. Eleanor ate alone. Afterward, she wandered the manor in careful exploration. She found a music room where a grand piano sat silent beneath a cover, a library lined with books untouched by dusted hands, a house filled with potential yet starved of warmth. Outside, the gardens called to her. She walked along cracked stone paths where roses grew wild and statues leaned beneath vines. The air smelled of earth and rain. In neglect, there was strange beauty. At the far edge of the grounds, she discovered a small pavilion overlooking the lake. It was quiet, sheltered, forgotten. On one of the stone benches lay a book and a pair of riding gloves. Someone had been there recently. Curiosity pulled her closer. The book was open to a page marked lightly in pencil, a poem about solitude and memory. "You need not apologize for being here." The voice behind her was calm but close. She turned quickly. Adrian stood at the entrance of the pavilion. His dark coat was damp from riding. His eyes rested on her, not cold this time, but searching. "I did not know it was yours," she said softly. "It is not mine," he replied. "It is simply where I sometimes think." She hesitated. I was reading the same poet this morning," she admitted, though I found it difficult to concentrate. His gaze sharpened slightly. "Change is rarely gentle," he said. She studied him, courage rising unexpectedly. "May I ask something?" He inclined his head. "Why marry me if you intend to keep me at a distance?" Silence stretched between them. For a moment she thought he would walk away. Instead, his expression shifted. "You believe I married you out of convenience alone," he said quietly. "Was it not so?" He stepped closer into the pavilion light. "No," he answered. Her heart stilled. "I have known you far longer than you realize, Eleanor." She frowned slightly. "We met only once." He shook his head slowly. "You do not remember me," he said. "But I remember you." The air seemed to thicken while I watched you feed swans in Richmond Park when you were barely 12. I saw you comfort a servant's child at a summer gathering while others laughed. I have seen you more times than you know." Her breath faltered. "I do not understand." "I loved you," he said simply, "long before this marriage was ever arranged." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The quiet pavilion, the lake beyond, the distant cry of birds all seemed to fade as his words settled between them. "I loved you." He had said it plainly, without drama, without softness, as if it were a fact he had carried for years. She stared at him, searching his face for mockery or cruelty. She found neither. What she saw instead unsettled her more. There was restraint in him, and something that looked dangerously close to fear. "You could not have," she whispered. You did not even know me." "I knew enough," Adrian replied. "Enough to see the way you moved through rooms others overlooked. Enough to notice you spoke to servants as if they mattered. Enough to remember." His jaw tightened slightly. "You were a girl then. I was already burdened with expectations. I stood at the edges of gatherings, performing my role. You likely saw only the title, not the man." Eleanor searched her memory desperately. Garden parties, church events, public gatherings in Richmond, faces blurred together, dukes and merchants and officers. She had never imagined one of them had been watching her. "If you felt such things," she said carefully, "why not approach my father honestly? Why not court me properly?" A shadow crossed his expression. "Because I feared you would refuse," he answered. "And I would rather live with guilt than rejection." The honesty of it struck her. "So you used my father's debts," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "Yes." He did not deny it. He did not soften it. "I told myself I was rescuing your family from ruin, that I was fulfilling my duty to marry. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I wanted you, and when opportunity presented itself, I took it." Eleanor sank onto the stone bench, her thoughts racing. She had arrived believing she was unwanted. tolerated, a burden purchased through necessity. Now he claimed she had been desired for years. "Then why," she asked slowly, "have you been so distant since I arrived? Separate lives, separate rooms, cold meals across long tables." Adrian exhaled deeply. He moved closer, but did not touch her. Because having you here," he said, "is both everything I hoped for and more than I deserve." She looked up at him. "You came to me without choice," he continued. "You look at me and see the man who arranged your life without your consent. I will not add pressure to resentment. Distance felt like mercy." She studied him in silence. What she had interpreted as indifference might have been restraint. "I thought you found me insignificant," she admitted quietly. His reaction was immediate. Pain flickered across his face. "You were never insignificant to me," he said. The words carried weight. Wind rustled through the trees around the pavilion. The air smelled of damp leaves and late autumn. "I do not know what to feel," Eleanor confessed. "I arrived prepared to endure this marriage, but not to discover it was built on years of secret longing." Adrian nodded once. "I do not expect forgiveness," he said. "Only understanding." He stepped back, giving her space. "You are free within this house," he continued. "Command it. Shape it. I will not stand in your way. I will not force affection from you." Then he turned and walked toward the manor, leaving her alone in the fading light. Eleanor remained seated long after he disappeared from view. Her thoughts churned. He had loved her silently for years, yet he had been too afraid to risk honest courtship, too proud or too wounded to face refusal. Was that weakness or vulnerability? She did not know. In the days that followed, something shifted between them. They remained formal in public spaces, polite, controlled. Yet there was an awareness now, and a current beneath every glance. Eleanor began to take small control of the household. She asked Mrs. Caldwell to open long, closed rooms. She ordered the piano tuned. She requested gardeners clear certain paths without destroying the wild charm of the grounds. Each request was approved without question. Sometimes, she found brief notes in Adrian's handwriting left upon her desk. "Your improvements are welcome. The house breathes differently already." She found herself watching him as he crossed the courtyard or reviewed ledgers in his study. His expression softened when he believed himself alone. Once, while playing the piano late one evening, she sensed someone near the doorway. She did not turn. She continued playing. When the final note faded, silence lingered. "I had forgotten," Adrian said quietly from the shadows, "how much music can change a room." She turned then. He stood just inside the threshold, hands clasped behind his back. "Do you dislike music?" she asked. "No," he replied. "I avoided it." "Why?" "It reminds me of my mother." The answer was simple but heavy. He stepped further inside. "She died when I was 9, he continued. The house fell silent after that. Eleanor felt something soften inside her. "I am sorry," she said. He nodded once. She was the only person who saw me as more than a future duke. The words echoed something she understood deeply. "I know what it is to be unseen," she said gently. Their eyes met. For the first time, the distance between them did not feel imposed. It felt chosen. Weeks passed. Autumn deepened. Leaves fell. The air grew sharper. Eleanor began reviewing household accounts more carefully. Numbers had always made sense to her. Patterns revealed truth if one looked closely enough. One rainy afternoon, she noticed irregularities in repair expenses listed under tenant cottages. The sums were excessive, repeated. She compared months, years. Money was disappearing. Her heart pounded as she gathered the ledgers and went to Adrian's study. He looked up when she entered, surprise flashing briefly across his features. "Is something wrong?" "Yes," she said. "I believe someone is stealing from you." He gestured for her to sit. She laid out the evidence carefully, explaining the inconsistencies. Her voice steadied as she spoke. She had always felt invisible in rooms dominated by men discussing business. Here, she felt clear. Adrian listened without interruption, his brow furrowed. When she finished, he leaned back slowly. "You are certain?" "Yes." Silence filled the room. Then, unexpectedly, admiration entered his expression. "This is thorough work," he said. "More thorough than mine." She blinked. "I merely paid attention." "That," he replied, "is rarer than you realize." He rose and came around the desk. He stood beside her, reviewing the documents again. Their shoulders nearly touched. "You have a keen mind," he said quietly. "You see what others overlook." Her breath caught slightly. He was looking at her not as obligation, not as decoration, but as equal. They worked side by side until lamps were lit, and evening fell unnoticed. When their hands brushed, reaching for the same page, neither pulled away immediately. A warmth began building that had nothing to do with firelight. "You are formidable, Eleanor," Adrian said finally. She laughed softly. "Hardly." "You are." His voice held conviction. The investigation that followed revealed corruption among 2 servants working with outside criminals in Richmond. The betrayal stung Adrian deeply, but he handled it firmly and fairly. Eleanor saw another side of him during those tense days: authority without cruelty, strength without arrogance. She found herself proud. One evening, after a long discussion with the magistrate, Adrian looked at her across the small dining table they now used instead of the grand hall. "I could not have uncovered this without you," he said. "You would have," she replied. "No," he answered. "You changed this house the moment you stepped inside it." The air between them felt charged. "Why did you truly ask me to London with you?" she asked suddenly. He hesitated only briefly. "Because I wanted you near." The honesty of it startled her. They left for Richmond 2 days later. The carriage ride was long, but strangely intimate. They sat side by side rather than opposite. He told her stories of his childhood, of riding alone for hours, of learning to bury feelings beneath responsibility. She spoke of her mother's death, of her father's slow descent into gambling, of feeling overlooked in her own home. At some point, their hands found each other on the seat between them. Neither commented. In Richmond, they stayed at his townhouse, her chambers connected to his through a shared sitting room. The first night, she lay awake listening to distant city sounds. A soft knock came at the connecting door. "Yes?" she called quietly. He entered in shirt sleeves, his formal coat removed. "I could not sleep," he admitted. "Neither could I." They sat before the fireplace. "Did you truly love me all those years?" she asked after a long silence. "Yes." "Even when I did not notice you?" He smiled faintly. "Especially then." She moved closer without thinking. "I am trying to understand you," she whispered. "Do not hurry," he said. But she reached for his hand. He inhaled sharply. "Eleanor," he murmured, "if you truly see me, you may find me less impressive than the title suggests." "I do not want the title," she replied. "Yeah, I want the man." Silence followed. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his hand to her cheek. His touch was gentle, almost uncertain. "If I kiss you," he said quietly, "it will not be as duty." Her heart pounded. "Then do not kiss me as duty." The kiss was soft at first, testing, questioning. She answered. What had begun as arrangement was becoming choice. When they pulled apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I will court you properly," he said, "even if we are already married." She smiled. "I think you are." He laughed softly, and for the first time since arriving at Ashford Manor, Eleanor did not feel invisible. She felt seen. When they returned to Ashford Manor, the house no longer felt like a prison to Eleanor. The iron gates did not seem as threatening. The stone walls did not feel as cold. The gardens, though still wild in places, looked full of possibility. She stepped down from the carriage, and Adrian offered his hand, not as a formality, but as something steady and real. This time, she did not hesitate to take it. That evening, they did not dine across a long, empty table. Instead, Adrian led her to a smaller room overlooking the west garden. Only 2 candles burned between them. The space felt intimate, almost private. "I have something to ask you," he said, once the servants had withdrawn. She studied him carefully. "You already have my name and my title," she replied softly. "What more could you ask?" He leaned forward slightly. "I want your trust, not because I purchased it, not because law demands it, but because you choose to give it." The weight of his words settled gently rather than heavily. "Well, you have it," she said after a moment. "Not because you loved me first, but because you have shown me who you are." Relief crossed his face so clearly that it startled her. "And who am I?" he asked quietly. "You are not cold," she answered. "You are careful. You are not distant. You are afraid of losing what matters." His gaze held hers. "You see too much," he murmured. "I see enough." That night, when they walked through the gardens, the pavilion where he had confessed his love no longer felt like a place of shock. It felt like a beginning. He stopped near the lake and turned to her fully. "Eleanor," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "I married you for selfish reasons. I will not deny it. But I wish to build something honest now. A real marriage, a partnership." She stepped closer. "What does that look like?" she asked. "It looks like shared decisions, shared burdens, shared joys. It looks like one bed instead of 2 separate wings." Her breath caught slightly. "And if I say yes," she whispered, "then I will spend the rest of my life proving I deserve you." The truth in his eyes made her chest tighten. "I do not need perfection," she said. "I need presence." He reached for her slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. When he drew her into his arms, it felt natural. Not forced, not arranged. Chosen. Their kiss beneath the autumn sky was no longer hesitant. It carried warmth and certainty. It carried promise. That night, Eleanor did not return to the East Wing. She walked beside him to his chambers, their steps unhurried but determined. Inside, the room felt less severe than she had imagined. At the fire burned low. The windows were partly open to let in the cool night air. Adrian paused before her. "Are you certain?" he asked again, not from doubt, but from respect. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "I am no longer here because my father arranged it. I am here because I choose it." What followed was not rushed or desperate. It was tender and careful. They moved slowly, learning each other without fear. There was no distance left between them, only closeness built on honesty. When morning came, Eleanor woke with sunlight across the bed and Adrian's arm around her waist. For the first time since her arrival, she felt entirely at peace. The seasons changed. Winter came and passed. Snow blanketed the gardens and forced them indoors. They spent long evenings in the library, reading aloud to each other. But sometimes she played the piano, while he listened openly rather than from shadows. Spring returned with bright green growth and new beginnings. Together, They redesigned the gardens. She planned the flowers. He oversaw the workers. Paths were cleared but not stripped of their wild charm. The pavilion was restored, not as a secret hiding place, but as a shared retreat. Visitors began to notice the difference in the house. Laughter was heard where silence once ruled. Music drifted from open windows. The servants moved with lighter steps. Years passed. Eleanor gave birth to a daughter first, then a son, then another daughter. Each child carried pieces of both of them. Adrian held each newborn with tears he did not attempt to hide. "You gave me more than I ever hoped for," he told her one quiet night as their youngest slept nearby. "We built this together," she replied. They faced challenges as all families do. Illness visited one winter. Crops failed one season. Financial strain returned briefly before strong harvests corrected it. Through each trial, they stood side by side. They no longer needed to speak constantly to understand one another. A glance across a crowded room was enough, and a touch on the hand during difficult conversations was reassurance. 10 years after the day she arrived in fear, Eleanor stood once more in the pavilion. Her hair now carried faint silver at the temples. Lines marked her face from laughter and worry alike. Yet she felt stronger than she ever had as a young bride. Adrian joined her quietly. "Our daughter will marry next spring," he said, looking out across the restored gardens. "Yes," Eleanor replied softly, "and she will marry for love." He turned to her. "I once nearly canceled our wedding," he confessed. "The morning your carriage arrived, I stood at my study window and almost sent word that I could not go through with it." She looked at him in surprise. "Why did you not?" "Because I loved you too much to let you disappear from my life." She smiled gently. "And I nearly ran," she admitted. "The night before I left my father's house, I thought my life was ending. And now? Now I know it was beginning." He took her hands in his. "We began wrongly," he said, "but we chose rightly every day after." She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. "You once told me I was never invisible to you," she murmured. "That is still true. And you were never as cold as I believed." He laughed softly. "Fear can look like coldness." She lifted her face and kissed him, not with the nervous uncertainty of youth, but with deep affection born from years shared. That evening, as they sat together in the library, while their children's voices echoed faintly down the hall, Eleanor reflected on the strange path her life had taken. That she had been married to a stranger by her father's desperation. She had arrived believing herself unwanted. She had mistaken restraint for rejection. And yet, from hidden love and careful patience, something steady and real had grown. Adrian looked up from his papers and caught her watching him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "That sometimes," she said softly, "what feels like loss is simply love waiting to be understood." He set his papers aside and opened his arms. "Come here," he said. She crossed the room and settled into his embrace, just as naturally as breathing. Outside, the gardens glowed in the fading light. The house stood strong and alive, no longer cold, no longer silent, no longer built on arrangement alone, but on choice, on partnership, on a love that had begun in secret and grown into something neither of them would ever regret.